Goethe thought Napoleon's mind was the greatest the world had ever produced. Napoleon's secretary Meneval, who saw him almost daily, said Napoleon had, quote, the highest intellect which has ever been granted to a human being, and also spoke of that winning charm which was so irresistible in Napoleon. Napoleon was destined for great things from a young age. His professor of history said, quote, a Corsican by birth and character, he will do something great if circumstances favour him. A school report from his military academy tells us the 15-year-old Napoleon was obedient, upright and grateful. His best subject was mathematics, and it was predicted he'd make an excellent sailor. His headmaster said he was thoughtful, gloomy, and had no friends. If he scolded Napoleon, he'd say, quote, Sir, I know it. His German teacher was the only one who saw nothing in him. He was not well liked by his classmates at the military academy either. A girl who knew him once said Napoleon was not a pretty boy like his brother Joseph, his head always too large for his body. His anger was frightful, though his smile captivating. So now that Napoleon's all grown up, let's begin with Goethe, one of the greatest writers in German history, who met Napoleon in 1808. He said Napoleon was always enlightened, clear and decided, his life like a demigod, from battle to battle and victory to victory. He was in a state of continual enlightenment, and his destiny was more brilliant than the world had ever seen before him, or perhaps will ever see again. He also noted the firmness of Napoleon in his replies, which he admired since he was rarely immobile. Bourrienne was a childhood friend of Napoleon's and later his secretary. They first met at 8 years old and remained close friends until they had a falling out at 33. He said Napoleon liked to be alone. He would often slip away without saying a word. Sometimes when they were in the theatre, they would suddenly discover him in the second or third tier, sitting alone, sulking. When he was in a good mood, he would usually give you a little knock on your head or pinch your ear. He usually joked around with someone by calling them names, but they were never in bad taste. When he was frustrated or annoyed, he would hum a tune in his unmusical voice and swing in his chair so far back Bourrienne was often afraid he'd fall. He had a habit of stooping over and holding his hands behind his back while walking. He had a twitch in his right shoulder and his mouth, which would move from left to right, usually when he was deep in concentration. It was while walking he gave Bourrienne his most important notes. While walking with someone he was friends with, he would often link his arm into theirs and lean on it. Bourrienne was the first to enter Napoleon's bedroom every morning, where Napoleon would usually tell him to let him lie a little longer. Usually he slept 7 hours and took a short nap in the afternoon. His presence was imposing rather than pleasing, and to people who didn't know him well, they were in awe. Even when Josephine with all her grace was in the room, it didn't matter when Bonaparte entered. All eyes were on him. He talked a lot, sometimes too much, particularly when travelling, but nobody could tell a better story than him. Another one of Napoleon's habits was sitting on top of a table, resting his arm on Bourrienne's shoulder and swinging his leg dangling off the table, moving it so much Bourrienne could hardly write properly. He could also never admit when he was wrong or that he made a mistake. He'd simply just say, something's gone wrong, or blame it on somebody else. General Count Rapp was a military officer and a personal assistant to Napoleon. He said Napoleon is only described as being violent and harsh by those who don't know him. His irritation and anger was always overcome by his kindness and generosity. He was extremely sensible and faithful. He loved his mother, wife, siblings, and other relatives. All of them except his mother caused him frustration, yet he never stopped overwhelming them with riches and honours. He was never stubborn in his opinions. He was always happy to hear opinions of those qualified in the topic. Lacoste was a French writer who lived with Napoleon on St. Helena for a year and a half. His book about Napoleon went on to become the greatest international bestseller of the 19th century. Lacoste says Napoleon has 2 excellent qualities, justice and a mind prone to attachment. Even when he's angry, he still has a sense of justice. He listens to people's arguments and never forgets favours people have done for him. He says Napoleon is sincere in his relationships, even if he doesn't make a show of it. Once he gets to know a person well, he cannot bear separation from them. People have attempted to represent Napoleon as a man of fury and implacable temper, but he didn't take out revenge on anybody, no matter what he suffered. His anger was usually let out violently, but soon quickly ended. If he thinks of someone who's done something bad to him, he simply reflects on all the things they have suffered and considers this their punishment. He will always forgive them, much to their astonishment. Louis Constant Wairy was Napoleon's personal valet. Napoleon understood how to be a great man and a simple man. His simplicity was as natural as his greatness. He loved his son and always used to mess around with him. He used to hold him up in front of the mirror while making faces until he cried laughing. Sometimes he'd dip his finger in the sauce and make him suck on it before smearing it on his face. Josephine would get angry, but Napoleon would just keep laughing while his son begged him to do it again. Wairy said Napoleon was sometimes more childish than the son. In private, he was nearly always cheerful and approachable, always asking questions about people's families, affairs, and pleasures. He also had a nervous twitch throughout his life, where he would twitch his right shoulder rapidly. He also tells a famous story of Napoleon pulling people's ears. He once did it to his physician, who cried, "Sire, you hurt me." The better the mood Napoleon was in, the harder he would pull your ear. Sometimes he would chase Wairy around the room and pull on his ear until Wairy cried out for him to stop. Only once ever did Wairy witness Napoleon get angry and lose his temper. After the death of his friend Marshal Lannes, which deeply affected him, he went out one day to get his horse. The superintendent of the stables was not around, and there was no saddle or bridle for the horse. The horse kicked him off, and then the superintendent arrived just as he was getting up off the ground. Napoleon completely lost his temper, picked up the horsewhip, and whipped him right across the face. Later on he felt terrible about it, and met with him to apologise. A few days later he sent him 3,000 francs. Napoleon's secretary Meneval said Napoleon once explained how clear his mind is, just like opening and closing a cupboard. Then he gained the power to fall asleep at will. Whenever he wanted to fall asleep, he would simply just close all the drawers in his head. He was a great father, but also a great son. He loved his mother dearly. His memory was so marvellous, he often remembered military matters better than the generals. He would often put his arm around Meneval's neck while pulling his ear, or patting him on the shoulder or cheek. He loved teasing people, but never in bad taste. He would often stay up all night working non-stop. All hours of the night he would be awake working with his secretaries. Auguste Marmont was a French general who eventually rose to become Marshal of the Empire. He said Napoleon was at his best when activity was required and the pressure was on for him to act, and during a crisis is when his superiority was really displayed. Outside the business, he had no problem chatting with others, and nobody brought more charm to a conversation than him. He talked about moral and political questions rather than science, where his knowledge actually wasn't that deep. He also liked joking, but never insulting, always in good taste, and often took part in their games. He said from the moment he arrived, his authority was imposed on everyone, and although he was a bit awkward in his bearing, there was still something masterful about him, and everyone felt the need to obey him. Nature had given him the genius for war, and right from the start his attitude was that of a man born for power. In Milan, Marmont was in awe of Napoleon's self-confidence and the, quote, boundless confidence that he inspired in others, and this confidence gave his speeches and actions a certainty. Marmont was struck by the depth of his character. Charles Vane was an Irish nobleman who met Napoleon in 1803. Charles eventually went on to fight against him years later. In a private letter to his father, he said he was struck by Napoleon's manners, and he was very different from the idea he had formed of him. His face broad, forehead vast, cheekbones high and chin long, fierce eyes and a fascinating smile. He has something new and original to say to everybody. Sir Frederick Louis Maitland was the man Napoleon personally surrendered to after Waterloo, and was with him on board the St. Helena. Maitland said Napoleon's manners were extremely pleasing, and he joined in every conversation and tried to get everyone in a good mood. He left a favourable impression on everyone he met. Maitland realised this was because he would turn the conversation into a topic he thought the other person would be interested in, and then he could show his advantage. He was great at controlling his temper, and never in Maitland's presence did he allow a worried or angry expression to take over. Even the day he was told he'd be sent to St. Helena, he simply continued and chatted with the same cheerfulness as usual. Admiral Lord Keith was fascinated with his conversation with Napoleon. He said if King George III could meet Napoleon, in half an hour they would have been best friends. The crew on board said, quote, if the people of England knew him as well as we do, they would not hurt a hair on his head. And while Wellington never met Napoleon personally, he famously said after Waterloo, Napoleon was worth 40,000 men on the battlefield. Not only do we know what Napoleon's personality was like, but we also know bits of his personal life too. For example, he had an obsession for hot baths. He saw them as a necessity and would often sit in them for 2 to 4 hours. Usually while Bourrienne read him the newspapers. He used to turn on the hot water so much that Bourrienne couldn't even see what to read with all the steam, and he'd have to open the door. He was addicted to heat in general. Wairy tells us he was very sensitive to cold, and a fire was lit 24/7 in all his rooms. We even know what Napoleon smelled like. Eau de Cologne 4711. He would often pour an entire bottle on his hair, neck and shoulders. He never wore jewellery. The only things you'd find in his pockets would be a handkerchief, a bonbon box, and a snuff box. He didn't eat often. When he did, he would never spend more than a few minutes eating. Almost every morning he had a simple breakfast of chicken dressed with oil and onions, called poulet provençal. After breakfast and dinner he always had a strong cup of coffee. He rarely drank alcohol, but if he did, he would drink wine and water it down like the ancient Greeks. When working at night time, he often had a cup of coffee with cream or chocolate. Napoleon hated medicine and had no trust in it. He called doctors charlatans and often joked to his doctor whether at the Last Judgment doctors or generals would be responsible for the higher number of deaths. In all my life, he told Lost Cause, I never once had a headache or a stomachache. Meneval said he never saw Napoleon ill, only the occasional vomiting. Though Bourrienne had else to say, he said he often helped Napoleon with his stomach pains. Wairy also said Napoleon used to get terrible stomach pains from eating so quickly. There is no agreement on Napoleon's health. He had an interesting remedy for whenever he was sick. He would simply just do the opposite of whatever he was doing at the time. If he had been doing nothing all day, he would suddenly ride 60 miles or hunt the whole day. Or if he had been extremely busy, he would simply just rest completely for 24 hours. According to him, this remedy never failed. Other cures for when he was sick was to fast, or to drink barley water, lemonade, or water containing orange leaves, or to exercise so he could sweat it out through perspiration. He said to the doctor on board the St. Helena, quote, "Our body is a machine for the purpose of life. It is organized to that end. That is its nature. Leave the life there at its ease. Let it take care of itself. It will do better than if we paralyze it by loading it with medicines." He liked playing chess and often passed away his days playing it in St. Helena. His favourite card games were PK or 21, which he would always cheat at. Though Las Cos tells us he would always admit he was cheating and divide up the winnings at the end. As for his favourite books, I already did a video on this. His favourite books were certainly either The Sorrows of Young Werther by Goethe, Parallel Lives by Plutarch, Ossian by James Macpherson, The Prince by Machiavelli, and Homer's Odyssey. He was not a smooth talker with women. Metternich, the Chancellor of the Austrian Empire, once said, quote, "Out of his mouth there never came one well-turned speech to a woman," although the effort to make one was often expressed on his face and in the sound of his voice. He spoke to women about their dresses or the number of children they had, and whether they nursed themselves. He said to Madame Charpentier, quote, "How ill you look in that red dress." He told Madame de Stael he ranked women according to their fertility, and he said women were, quote, "machines for making children." As for his appearance, many people noted throughout his life his beautiful blue eyes, nice hands, smooth skin, and nice smile. Sir Frederick Louis Maitland said Napoleon was remarkably strong and well built. His hands were small and feminine, his teeth white and his hair dark brown, and his skin a light sallow, something uncommon he had never seen before. Wairy thought this painting was the most accurate he had ever seen of Napoleon. He had very attractive hands, with Wairy going as far as to call them beautiful. His good looks grew later as he got older and his skin became more white. He found suicide to be extremely cowardly, merely an act for the weak. He said a man must never be swayed by impulse in the moment. Though it was one of his favourite topics to discuss, it's hard to say whether Napoleon was religious. There's many differing accounts. He was raised Catholic, but he lost his Catholic faith as a teenager. Nonetheless, he still retains respect for it throughout his life, and he said it's better to be a Catholic than a Protestant. We can assume his lasting respect for the Catholic Church in 1801 with the Concordat, the treaty between Napoleon and the Pope. He also had a respect for Islam and Muhammad, though most likely his respect for Muhammad came mainly from a military point of view. He viewed him as a great leader rather than a great philosopher. He also agreed with Muhammad's view on women. They are below men, and their purpose is to make children. He said maybe we should worship the sun. After all, it's the source of all life on earth. He said religion was merely the work of man, saying he would believe in religion if it had existed since the beginning of time. In general, he was vague and inconsistent on the matter. There's a famous story of how one night on deck while travelling to Egypt, Napoleon was arguing with a group of scientists on religion. He looked up at the stars and said, quote, "You may talk as long as you please, gentlemen, but who made all that?" He didn't like to look at the world from a materialistic point of view. He saw the world from a more metaphysical perspective. He also saw religion as a means of keeping the masses in place, and also something that keeps the fabric of society together as a sort of invisible force. He recognised the moral benefits of religion and said that the most religious countries are those which do the most good. He famously said religion, quote, "stops the rich from being massacred by the poor." In Napoleon's view, as long as people remembered you and kept memories of you in their head, in that way you never die. Nevertheless, in despite of all this, the first section of his last will and testament highlights his Catholic faith. Thanks for watching. If you want to see more history videos, please make sure to like, comment and subscribe. Thank you.